All right. Great. Okay, so that was just me setting up the recording for the show. So, all right. So today and also next week, we're going to be talking about the harmony between Scripture and science, but specifically focusing on Genesis 1 and 2, the creation accounts that are there. Okay, so just kind of as an overview, so read this about Genesis 1. The first of two contradictory creation accounts. Compare with Genesis 2, verses 4 through 25, in which the order of events is entirely different. So that's from the Skeptic's Annotated Bible, which is no friend to Christianity. But here's the thing. So Genesis 1 and 2 deal with distinct aspects of creation. Genesis 1, the physical creation, and Genesis 2, the spiritual creation. And so their point is different. And so there's no reason why Genesis 2 is trying to give us a chronology, whereas Genesis 1 might be. The other thing to keep in mind is when the Bible speaks of natural phenomena, it should be error-free when interpreted correctly. Now, that doesn't mean that the Bible goes out and acts as a scientific textbook. It doesn't teach us about science, but if it does talk about the creation, if it is God's word, it should be correct. And as in most every aspect of the Bible, both Genesis 1 and 2, the focus is on God, the Creator. So the focus is not on science or history or whatever. The focus is on God and how he's acted in the world. Okay, so the thing to remember about Genesis 1 is that there are specific theological points that are being presented there. The first and main one is that God is the creator. The second one is that it seems to be providing to the Hebrews a counterpoint to the other ancient Near Eastern myths. It gives us a work week analogy. So, and by the way, sorry, I didn't say this, but I'm assuming that everyone is at least marginally familiar with Genesis 1 and what it says. So it gives us a work week analogy. So there are other places in Scripture that reference Genesis 1's work week and compare that to a human work week. It also tells us that humans are made in God's image, not dogs. Dogs are not made in God's image. It tells us that humans are custodians of the earth. It also tells us that in a stepwise fashion, God transformed the earth from being unfit for life to being fit for life, and in particular for human life. So what I'm hoping to talk about today is three main points. The first one is that we want to clear away common misconceptions. So a lot of times skeptics will point to Genesis 1 and they'll say, look, this is ridiculous, right? I mean, it has the science all wrong. And so let's clear away some of these misconceptions that are basically stumbling blocks to the idea that Christianity could be a worldview that's taken seriously by scientists. So after that, we're going to clear these common misconceptions. The next, I'm going to talk about the chronology of the creation week as it's laid out in Genesis 1. And then I'm also going to give other interpretations that are also potentially harmonizable with science. So the main interpretation that I'm going to be presenting today is something called the day-age view, which I don't think is the only way to interpret it, but I think it is our way to interpret it, and it may even be the best way, in my opinion. Okay, so what we're going to start with is that first bullet point, clearing these common misconceptions out of the way, specifically the meaning of this Hebrew word yom, which is usually translated day, and also we're going to look at days 1 and 4. Okay, so the first stumbling block to potentially accepting Genesis 1 as a historical chronology and being harmonizable with what we know about the world from our scientific study. First point is that we have to understand that Scripture does not demand a young earth. And I don't know where all of you stand here on this issue. Maybe some of you were taught that the world is 6,000 years old or 10,000 years old or something like that. And that's the only way to interpret Genesis 1, but I don't think it demands that. I don't think there's a reason to believe that it has to be a young earth. So this Hebrew word yom, which is translated as day, it has lots of several different meanings that it could take on, but just right there in the text, the word day could mean 24 hours, which you see in verse 14. It could mean the daylight hours, so 12 hours roughly, which you see in verses 5, 14, 16, and 18, or it could be a long period of time, which you see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, which in some ways is a bridge between the creation account in Genesis 1 and the one in Genesis 2. So there are actually three different ways that non-controversially the Hebrew word yom is interpreted just directly here in this passage. And I'm not even touching on the particular interpretation of the word yom that is under controversy, which is when it says things like, the first day and day 2 and day 3, etc. So scriptural arguments can actually be made that this controversial usage of the word yom, or this controversial place where it says day 1 and day 2, etc., can actually be translated as a long period of time, and that might actually be the favorable translation. So, for example, in days 1 through 3, you don't actually have, according to the common interpretation, young earth interpretation, which says that the world is 6,000 years old, during those first 3 days, the sun and the moon don't even exist. So if the sun and moon don't exist, or specifically the sun, then what does day even mean during those 3 days? Also, it appears from what we read in Hebrews 4, it appears that day 7 is actually still ongoing. So if day 7 can be a long period of time, why not the other ones? And if you compare what happens in day 6 to what we're told in Genesis 2, then it appears that day 6 is also a very long period of time. So basically, what this leaves is if you think that this is an argument that holds water, then only days 4 and 5 actually could even be possibly interpreted as a regular day. And the other ones cannot. Although, I think you could stretch this a little too far, but basically I think you could make the argument that at least these 5 occurrences of the word yom in Scripture could be interpreted as a long period of time. So what do you guys think? What are the main problems with accepting this view of an ancient earth and universe, with accepting this idea that the days of Genesis 1 could be long periods of time rather than 24 hours? So what I'm going to give you guys a chance to do is to think over this question, discuss it maybe with someone sitting in your row or getting in groups of 2, 3, or 4, and then we're going to bring the discussion back to me in just a little bit. So you guys discuss. Okay, so what do you guys think? Someone want to volunteer a point that you discussed? No one wants to volunteer? Yes, Derek. Oh.
Crack open the Bible, right off the bat, day might not actually mean day, it might mean something else.
Okay.
Then later on, perhaps you might have issues, does that word actually mean what it says right there, or is it something else? Or
Okay, so to summarize, basically, if you question definitions, what are the boundaries, right? Maybe you can question the definition of any word. And if you don't mind me saying, so the thing about Hebrew is that as a language, it was a much smaller language than English. And a lot of these words were meant to take on different meanings, right? So these are known definitions. So it's not like someone is going in there and saying, well, I don't like this being 24 hours, so I'm going to just pretend like it could mean something else. So this is actually a known, acceptable definition of that word. But even in English, it can be stretched like that. I mean, you could say, back in the day, I blah, 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 and someone isn't going to stop you and say, well, which day are you talking about? You're talking about one 24-hour period back there, right? Or, in the day of the dinosaur. Well, dinosaurs lived for more than one day, I think. So, and yeah. Yeah, but these are actually also literal definitions of this word. So it's not just an expression or a metaphor. Yeah, sure, yeah, okay, yeah.
Something that actually you brought up was that if you do have an ancient earth and an ancient universe, that means that death was on earth before the fall of man.
Right, okay, so yeah, so this is a big one. So death before the fall, right? So if the world is as old as that, then animals died before sin entered the world through Adam's sin, and therefore doesn't that, make God a God who allows death rather than something that has come into the world through sin only, right? So Katie, you want to say something about that?
Well, I was going to say, it does not necessarily.
What do you mean?
I mean, God could have let animals live forever before the fall.
Right, that he could have let them live forever before the fall, except for before man was created, the world had been around for millions of years, billions of years. and therefore all these animals died before sin happened. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, yeah.
Right.
We're talking about possibilities here, but yeah.
So, but it sounded like you had a counter argument to that.
Well, I was gonna say, it's not necessarily that there had to be death.
With which view? The old Earth view? The old Earth view?
I
But
would say
what-
the fossil record says.
but so were you suggesting that if the Earth was billions of years old, then animals never died before the fall?
When I'm saying, like, a lot of the fossils that we're finding
Uh-huh.
don't necessarily show that the Earth's been around for millions of years. So I'm just saying, if it doesn't show that.
Okay. Right. But I guess the question is saying, if you accept that the world is billions of years old, does that present problems to Christianity? Right. Okay. So you guys had a point over here?
I don't think it does, because there's a big difference between an animal dying or a plant dying
Uh-huh.
and something with the image of God.
Okay, so there's a difference. So this is a good point. So in terms of the death before the fall, animals are not equal to humans. Right, so humans are made in the image of God only, and animals dying is different from humans dying. Okay, and actually we're going to cover this more next week. So, but you had another point?
Basically, a counter. While animals are not equal to humans, later in the Bible you have a passage that says, "And death entered the world through one man," and you also have the first record of an animal dying is when God kills the sheep to make Adam and Eve clothing. It happens after the fall.
So just because it's the first record means it's supposed to.
Okay, just to summarize that, so biblically it says that death entered through sin,
Yes.
and also in the Bible it doesn't talk about animals dying until after the fall, right? So yes, that's a good point. And we will cover this more next week, actually. It's more of a Genesis 2 question. So, but yeah, it's a good point. All good points to think about. And Forrest, you had something to say?
Okay, a couple things. Just because there's no mention of it doesn't mean it's not there. The Bible doesn't mention a lot of things that obviously happened.
All right, so counterpoint to Will's point up here is that, just because the Bible doesn't say the animals died before the fall doesn't mean they didn't,
Right.
right? Okay, sure. And we're talking about a very small portion of the Bible before it gets to the fall. And it's not even necessarily talking about things that you might think that they would say animals died, right?
And also, does it follow necessarily that because the earth is that old, the animals had to have died?
Does it follow necessarily that because the earth is that old, the animals have had to have died? And I think it pretty much does.
Why?
Well, not necessarily like in terms of, metaphysical necessity, but I think, everyone pretty much knows that no animal lifespan is more than 543 million years.
Right. Well,
And if you are accepting the ancient earth and ancient universe, you may actually, I admit this, you may be partially motivated by the scientific evidence that points to that, which also part and parcel comes with understanding that the fossil record is probably accurate.
right. Well, in today's age, you wouldn't expect people to live 900 years old. But at that point in time, you would accept that Adam lived 900 years. Right.
So you're saying that it's possible before the fall that every animal that ever existed was still alive?
I'm saying it's possible.
It's possible. Okay, all right. However unlikely.
I'll say possible, but not necessarily probable or plausible.
Okay. Do you have any evidence to suggest that it didn't happen that would make it?
Fossil record sedentary rock, you can just kind of watch.
Also, have you ever seen how fast rabbits reproduce?
How about what?
Rabbits reproduce? That's meant to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? Anyway, okay, all good points. Does anyone want to have anything else to say before we move on?
And also-
Yes, oh,
So you would ask me about.
hold on, we need the discussion here.
And one more counterpoint to the death before the fall and equal animals. It may just be NIV translation that only says this, but it says, "But God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." And it says "you," meaning Eve and Adam.
That's right.
So it could just specifically mean human death. From what
Right. So in addition to that, eating from the tree in the middle of the garden of knowledge of good and evil, God says you will die, but not necessarily animals, right? So he's specifically talking about humans, maybe, right? But I think the whole idea of death before the fall is a good point, because if you if you think that death is not part of God's good creation, and animal death is also not part of God's good creation, then why would God allow animals to die before sin entered the world, right? So I want to end here on this discussion. Sorry, Forrest. We can pick it back up later when we actually talk about Genesis 2. Oh, and Curtis had one more point.
Sure, I'm not sure, but I think it's in day 3 we have vegetation, and day 4 we have the sun.
Yes.
So if it's a long day, then the vegetation should have died because you didn't have water.
Okay, so day 3 we have vegetation, and day 4 we have the creation of the sun, right? And if it's a long day, then the vegetation would have died without the sun. And actually, okay, so we'll get to that point too in just a second as well. So good, all good points. All right.
You didn't write it down.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, let's write this down. Well, the reason why I didn't write it down is because we're going to get to it here, right? Okay. So in terms of the stumbling block, so that's the first one. And if you accept okay, so there are counterpoints, arguments on both sides, but I hope I've convinced you that it's at least possible that it's within the Hebrew language that Yom could be interpreted as a long period of time, not just strictly as a 24-hour day. And I'm not saying it has to be, I'm just saying it could be. And in addition to that, I wanted to point out that that there are scriptural arguments to say that it's a long period of time. Okay, now there's another stumbling block here that's potential, which is the idea of the sun and the moon. So here's the problem. The problem is that in the apparent order of creation events, the earth was created first, right? In Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth. In Genesis 1:3, he says, let there be light. So there's light. So there's earth and light. But then the sun, moon, and stars don't get created until day 4, which are in verses 14 through 18. Right? So how could the sun, moon, and stars be created after the earth? And specifically, we're talking about, and so this doesn't necessarily have to do with the length of the creation days, but it has to do with the ridicule that may be piled on top of Christianity by scientists who think that this is a ridiculous idea that the earth could have existed before the sun, especially when we turn towards our models of solar system and planetary formation, in which the sun is basically the first thing that accretes out of the solar disk and the solar nebula. So how could the sun, moon, and stars be created after the earth, possibly? So again, discussion, I want you guys to think about this. In terms of maybe a biblical creation account that you might be familiar with, like maybe a young earth account, what is the common response to this ridicule? So, go ahead. Yes.
I'm sorry, it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't specifically say that the earth was the first thing created.
Okay, so heavens could be first.
It mentions that he did things. The first actual event of you seeing him create anything is when he says, let there be light. The first 2 verses are basically just background saying that this is what happened. Verse 3, this is how it happened.
Okay. So it's possible that the earth was not created in verse 1:1 when it says the heavens and the earth. That's just sort of like, kind of maybe a section header. It could be like, hey, I'm about to tell you how God did this. And then when God said, let there be light, that was the first thing that was created, quote, created. Okay, sure. But then you still have the problem of, clearly, right after that, it says the earth was formless and void, and God that's actually before the let there be light, right? The earth was formless and void before let there be light. So there still had to be an earth before the light. That would be verse 2 then. Instead of verse 1, it'd be verse 2, right? So, but no, it's a good point. I think you're driving at kind of a good point here. And darkness was over the surface of the deep was the second part of that verse, right? And then he says, let there be light. Okay, good. But in addition to that, you still have the problem of the sun, moon, and stars being created 3 or 4 days later, depending on how you want to count, inclusively or not. So, anyone else want to?
So what's the problem here?
The problem is that if you have the earth, how could you have an earth without a sun, basically?
Okay. So
Where does the light come from, for example?
the light could have just been a product of the Big Bang, right? We don't.
The light could have been a product. Well, if we're going to go through the Big Bang, you're probably going to accept that the sun was there before the earth, scientifically, because that's what our models say.
When does the Bible say the earth was created?
I would say verse 2. It doesn't tell us the time, but in verse 2 there is the earth there.
But in Hebrew language, there's
In Hebrew language, there's always a summary before it actually tells you the details. Okay, but I think, as you can tell in verse 2, it's a pretty detailed account at that point already. So the summary is probably verse 1, if that is indeed the case. Are you suggesting otherwise?
Yeah, I would think that both 1 and 2 would be summary.
Okay. So verses 1 and 2 would both be summaries, and then let there be light actually is, so you're kind of taking Will's point, but you're extending the summary to be the first 2 verses. Okay, I hadn't thought of that. That's interesting. So verses 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2 could be section headers, if you will, or summaries. Pardon my bad handwriting. Okay, yeah. I don't actually know your name. What's your name? Zach. Wait, Zach's got the floor.
Could the phrase "He created heaven and earth,"
Mm-hmm.
rather than like Earth meaning this specific planet, mean like the dichotomy between the existence of heaven and the existence of not heaven?
Okay, so it could be basically verse 1 could be the heavens and the earth could refer to 2 realms.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the modern, actually, let me go ahead and interject this. The modern scholarship thinks that the conjunction, the heavens and the earth, just means all of creation. So it doesn't necessarily mean 2 different realms or specific entities, but it just means in the beginning, God created all that there is. Because there's no Hebrew word for the universe. The cosmos or something like that. Forrest. Yeah, no problem. Oh.
So verse 2 says, "Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the surface of the depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light." So regardless, we still end up with the earth before the sun.
Okay, so what you're saying is there are contextual clues, which makes it sound like verse 3 is chronologically happening after verse 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then this happened.
Okay, so then God said, let there be light. All right, sweet. Okay, yeah, Will?
So if we go with that, they're saying that heavens and earth simply means universe, then how do we compare this to like several other times throughout the course of the Bible where heavens is meant to mean heaven itself,
Right.
and earth is just that which is not heaven? Because if earth is that which is not heaven, then you still, and that can be formless and void without planet Earth still being there. Let there be light.
No. Okay, yeah, so it's not that, I think the point of that, my saying that the heavens and the earth meant the totality of everything, is that the grouping of those words together mean one thing, but you can't break them in half and say heaven means half of that and earth means the other half. So when you see the words together, the heavens and the earth, that means everything. But when you see the word heaven, that means heaven, or maybe the skies, and the earth just means the planet Earth. But it's not like, when you break them in half, when you put them together, it's the sum is more than their parts. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. There we go. Thank you.
So think of it this way: Hebrew is also a language of pictures, and so to mean something, you sometimes need more than one word. You need to form the picture to understand the meaning. In this case, it is the same sort of concept where we have heavens and the earth, or a picture that means everything that's created, and it actually means a new creation. It's the creation out of nothing.
Is a creation out of nothing. Well, not out of pre-existing material, right? So there's still a creator. I'm surprised actually that no one said. Okay, so here's the main. If the main ridicule here, coming from outside Christianity, is to say, how can the earth exist without the sun? Back to Curtis's point from the last stumbling block. How could there be plants on day 3 that survive until day 4 without sun? How could there be light without the sun? Where does the light come from? And usually what I hear is that the response is the light is God's Shekinah glory, right? That's where the light comes from. And so So maybe the light is God's glory, right? So light equals God's glory, right? So that's the common response to that. And so here's what I say about that. If the light is God's glory, then it has to be, in order for plants to live even a day on planet Earth, then the light coming from God's glory has to have the same electromagnetic signature as the sun. So in every way, it has to be indistinguishable from sunlight, pretty much. I mean, I guess not as indistinguishable, but pretty close, right? In addition to that, if the Earth isn't anchored in space by the sun's gravity, then lots of things would get messed up on Earth. So even a day without the sun's gravity affecting Earth, life would not survive. So in addition to there being the light coming from God's glory, there also has to be some body out there in space, 93 million miles away, that has the same gravity as the sun. So you have basically an object in space, which is in every way like the sun, and then randomly on day 4, God takes away that body and replaces it with the sun, which is a really weird way of looking at things. So that's why I don't think the light equaling God's glory makes any sense. Now, no one said that. No one suggested that as a response here. But I did want to put that out there for you to think about. Okay, so I hope, though, that we have gotten through this idea. Okay, so verse 1 may be a section header, or it could be chronological. But in any case, what I think verse 1 is saying, and what I think scholarship says, is that basically, in the beginning, God created the universe, the totality of everything. And it's not saying that the heavens and planet Earth appeared right then. It's a phrase that means everything. Verse 2, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Then in verse 3, it says, let there be light. So where does this light come from if it's not the sun? Right? So here's the thing. The key mistake in most people's interpretation here of Genesis 1 is that you miss the point of view shift in in chapter 1, verse 2. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then verse 2 says, and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the deep. And so what it's telling you is that the rest of the chapter is told from the point of view of someone on the surface of the earth. God's Spirit hovering over the surface of the earth. So this is the point of view shift. So at this point, the earth is formless and void, and darkness is there. There's darkness there because there's darkness at the surface of the earth, which does not necessarily mean that the sun didn't exist. It just means that there was no light coming to the surface of the earth. Now hold on to that thought. Hold on to that thought. So the next verse says, let there be light. Now this Hebrew word, let there be, or come to pass, does not mean create. So in verse 3, it's not saying that God created light. It just means that God was allowing light to illuminate the surface of the earth. Let there be light. Let there be light here on the surface of the earth. And what that's saying is it's not saying that this is when the sun was created, or this is when light was created. It is entirely within the realm of translation here that there was light out there, and this is the first time that it hit the surface of the earth. Now, how could that be? Am I just making stuff up here to try to fit things into my own point of view? Not necessarily, because we understand that if there was a thick cloud cover over the surface of the earth, that would have kept it dark. And that's exactly what Job tells us, is that when God created the earth, he wrapped it in thick clouds. And I can't imagine any other time in Earth's history when it would be completely wrapped in thick clouds. So, in addition to that, if you read Job 38, it reads as if God were telling about the way he created the world. So this is not just something that I'm just making up and pulling out of thin air. But in addition to that, it has scientific merit. So I'll get to that in a second. But basically what's going on here is that when God says, let there be light, he's actually allowing the cloud cover to become thinner so that you can see light from the surface of the earth at some level. Right? So what about this part in day 4? We still have to deal with the fact that in day 4, that's when it says the sun and the moon were created. But if you look at the verb tense in verse 16, it says it's translated made a lot, but it's the same word in Hebrew in the same tense as the translation had made. So you could say, by the way, God had made the sun, moon, and stars. So it's not saying that God made at that point in time the sun, moon, and stars. It just means that at some point in the past, previous to that point, the sun, moon, and stars had been made. So in day 4, at the beginning of day 1, the atmosphere went from opaque, wrapped in thick cloud cover, where there was darkness over the surface of the deep, from opaque to translucent. So you could see light coming through the clouds at that point. That's the let there be light moment. Then in day 4, when it says you can now see the sun, moon, and stars, that's where it went from this translucent kind of haze to being transparent. So you can actually see the objects. Now, why would I say that? Oh, by the way, so the original cloud cover on Earth, scientifically, we think it was a lot like the cloud cover that's on Venus today, completely opaque. So we think that there's no light that actually gets to Venus's surface. Yeah. That's just from analyzing the composition of the atmosphere in Venus. And we can do that spectroscopically. Do we send probes to Venus? I don't know. They would have burned up. No, we don't know the Earth was like Venus. Sorry. Oh, I get it. I get your question now. We don't know the Earth was like Venus, but we basically, that is what best fits the planetary models. That if you have a planet that has enough gravity, then it would retain its original primordial atmosphere like Venus does. And if you have a planet that doesn't have enough gravity like Mars, it would lose its atmosphere. Since Earth has more gravity than Venus, we think that it would have kept its dark, we think that it would have had the same atmosphere that Venus does today. But what caused the Earth to lose its atmosphere? Why isn't it still opaque? And I think we'll get to that in a second. Okay, or a little bit later. What time is it? Oh, wow, it's 7:45 already. Okay, so the next thing to realize is that what is the stated purpose of these greater and lesser lights in verse 14? So if you look at verse 14, it says, this is when there's the greater light and the lesser light that God made. What's that? I think that was day 1. All right, well, to separate the day from the night, and to do what? What's next?
And to let them be signs for seasons.
And to let them be signs for seasons, days, and years, right? So the purpose of these lights that you can finally see in the sky is to mark the passage of time. And it wasn't until day 5, which is right after he allowed the atmosphere to become transparent, that you start to have life being introduced that's going to rely on being able to see the sun, moon, and stars in order for their biological clocks to tick correctly. So but all the life on planet Earth up until this point has been bacterial life that didn't need to be able to see visually the lights in the sky first. The plants could survive on the translucent light, where they didn't have to actually see the sun. See, quote, in quotes.
Another question. Could the let there be light, could that have been, say, a sunrise, since we're saying that the point of view is on the surface of the Earth?
So you're saying that in day 1, where it says there was darkness over the surface of the deep, let there be light was the first sunrise?
Sure, I'm asking.
I hadn't thought about that. It could be. I would have to think about it more to see how consistent that view holds through all the way. Okay, so I think we ended there. So let's go ahead and, unless there are other questions about it, let's move on to the actual chronology there in the creation week. So actually it turns out that if you look at so now that we've cleared away these misconceptions, and we perhaps accept that it's possible that Yom could mean a long period of time, and as well, days 1 and 4, their translation does not limit us to saying that the sun, moon, and stars were created on day 4, that they were created at some time in the past, and the reason why light reached the surface of the Earth at some point in day 1 and not before is because there was thick cloud cover. So if we accept those two common misconceptions as being cleared away, then the creation week chronology actually lines up really well with what we know from science. So there are at least 11 major events laid out in Genesis 1 that have been affirmed by scientific discovery, which you can read there. But basically, the universe had a beginning. The primordial Earth was dark, kind of like Venus is today. It was unfit for life. We know that to be true. It was covered in water, and we scientifically we believe that to be true as well. Early on in Earth's history, this thick cloud cover was exchanged for a thinner atmosphere. Unlike Venus, that did not happen to Venus. At some point, the water cycle began, then dry land appeared, photosynthetic plant life appeared, the oceans swarmed with life, advanced animals appeared, and finally humans appeared on the scene. And this is the order that you would take it from the Genesis creation account. Now, there may be other events in Genesis 1 that also align with what we know historically from science, but I'm not aware of those. This is what I know. So let's go ahead and go through some of these. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. We had a question where I wanted you to discuss whether or not it was actually risky to perhaps propose that the Bible is predictive in this fashion. And I think what I wanted to come up with here was that a lot of people will say, well, if you want to say that Genesis 1 is the correct ordering from science, then what happens one day if science actually changes its mind? Because science is always tentative. But let me go ahead and skip that. Maybe we can have a discussion on that later. But the primordial Earth, early on, we know that there are two major impact events. First of all, the current model for the way that the moon was formed is that there was a planet that collided with Earth and blew away a lot of the thick atmosphere. In addition to that, this collider and what's called the late heavy bombardment, where the Earth was bombarded by asteroids, kept the early Earth unfit for life. Also, the primordial Earth was probably wrapped in these thick clouds, much like Venus is today, and it was covered in water. So this is what we think is true about the early Earth from science, and that's kind of how Genesis 1 describes it. When we had the moon colliding event, or the moon forming event, because a Mars-sized body collided with the Earth, that actually blew away a lot of this thick atmosphere. It also converted our deep oceans into steam, and so blew away a lot of the water, and it formed the moon, and it also enriched the Earth with heavy elements like uranium. Now, that last part is not really all that important for today's discussion, but it does have to do with the fine-tuning argument. After that, at some point after the late heavy bombardment ended, which was about 3.85 billion years ago, the water cycle began, which is the order that it's told in the Genesis account. After that, dry land and plants appeared. So studies from the Earth's crust show that continental formation happened aggressively in bursts. And this actually aligns with day 3 in terms of the timing. And a recent discovery has shown that right around then is when we actually have the earliest plant life. After that, you have day 4, where for some unknown scientifically event transformed the Earth's atmosphere from translucent to transparent. And after that, on day 5, you have the waters teeming with life, which corresponds to the Cambrian explosion. I think pretty much any biologist would actually be able to see that. That's exactly what I think of, was the waters teeming with life. After that, during day 6, God created 3 types of advanced animals, and then that day 6 culminated with the creation of man. All of these things are how they happened in history. But there are still problems. So there are 3 potential problems here with this chronology. The first one is that the vegetation, which is assumed to be flowering plants, is produced on day 3 before there were the animals that would be able to pollinate them, right? So flowering plants exist in this symbiotic ecosystem relationship with insects, and insects didn't show up on the scene until day 5. So scientifically, that doesn't make any sense. Also, if you read day 5, birds and aquatic mammals are created before the land mammals and reptiles, potentially. And kind of minor, but day 3 seems to favor the interpretation that most or all of the continents were formed on day 3. But we know that land formation continued after that. So in terms of the first problem, blah, 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 like I said, a recent discovery has shown that plant life did exist before these animals existed. So before, it was scientifically farcical to assume that plant life existed that long ago, but actually we know now that it did. So there is some form of plant life that was on the planet that we don't really know about today that that can't be equated with flowering plants, but it was there. And also, like I said, if you study the Earth's crust formation, day 3 actually is when a lot of the continents were formed anyway. So even if more continents formed later, it's still a pretty good description of the way that things happened. So I think I accidentally put that slide in 2 places, which is why I got covered twice. But anyway, I think I'll quickly just go through some other interpretations. There are 2 other interpretations that you could take out of Genesis 1. And the reason why I'm putting this here is that I don't want you guys to feel like I'm preaching some exact interpretation of Genesis 1, because this is all tentative, right? It's just some interpretation. It's some way to harmonize the creation accounts. It's a strong positive case for Christianity, I think, if you take the fact that these 11 events actually did happen in the order that's described in Genesis 1. But there's also this view called the analogical day view. There's also a framework hypothesis view. And also you could just sort of there's a theological point only to Genesis 1. But the analogical day view just says, hey, look, these days of the creation week, they're just analogies to our work week. So they don't have to be 24-hour days. And so they're not identical to our work week. And for example, there are work week analogies where the days don't correspond to 24-hour days. So in Exodus 23, it's talking about years for each day. So it says something like, just like God worked for 6 days and rested for a 7th, you should till the land for 6 years and let it rest for a 7th year. So it's sort of an analog there where days kind of equate to years in that sense. Also, there's the year of Jubilee, where you have 7 years of work, and then the final year, everyone is released from their debts. And in addition to that, there's a Jubilee of all Jubilees, where you have 7 groups of 7 years, and then the 50th year, there's like the ultimate Jubilee, which I forget what that's called, the year of the Lord's favor. Right? And so here's the point. God took his time in creation to have 6 of X of work, and then 1 work, and then 1 X of rest as a pattern. So he gave that pattern to us of 6 plus 1. So it doesn't have to be days. Could be years. Could be groups of years. So when a creation week doesn't have to be exactly 144 hours plus 24. Right? There's also this framework hypothesis, which takes into account that Genesis 1 has a literary genre. And the literary genre is key. So if you read the way that the Genesis 1 account is set up, there's parallelism there. In the first 3 days, you have the creation of a domain, and then in the second 3 days, you have the filling of that domain. So in day 1, you have day and night being created, and day 4, you have the sun, moon, and stars. In day 2, you have oceans and sky being created. In day 5, you have sea creatures and, quote, flyers or birds being created. On day 3, you have dry land appear, and on day 6, you have land animals and humans being talked about. So there is some sort of parallelism that's going on there. And so the thing to remember is that when the Bible in Genesis 1 is talking about the things that are created on certain days, it doesn't necessarily mean an exhaustive account. There's no reason why Genesis 1 is trying to tell us every single little thing that was created on each day. It may not even be telling us an order. It might just be a literary genre that is evidenced here by this parallelism. But I think the fact that the order lines up so well with what we know from science is a hint that maybe it is an order. But in addition to that, it selectively told us different things about creation so that there could be a parallelism in terms of the genre. So I think that the framework hypothesis, this analogical work week view, as well as the day-age view that I presented, could all be, maybe all 3 of them are true as well. And also don't forget that there's a theological point to Genesis 1. Remember, God is the creator. It's a counterpoint to ancient Near Eastern myths. It's a work week analogy. Tells us that humans are made in God's image and humans are custodians of the earth. So the point of Genesis 1 is not, like I said, it's not an exhaustive list of everything that created in the order that it was created. It's sort of hitting the highlights. It has a literary genre that suggests parallelism. And loosely, it does a pretty good job of giving us the creation chronology that we know from science. So what I would take away from this in terms of Genesis 1 is that the most important thing is that God is the creator. As a chronology, that's probably the least important thing to take out of Genesis 1. So I think it's a mistake to try to use it as a timekeeping device, because I don't think that's the main point. But I do think it's interesting that it would be incredibly improbable if Moses or whoever wrote this down were randomly guessing the order of events and got it all right. So here's a quick timeline summary there of all the potential creation events that are happening there. And for further reading. Let me go ahead and stop there. We had a lot of discussion up front, but then I just sort of talked at you for a while. So let's go to questions. Questions? Anybody? No? All right, good. I'll see you next week.
What's your personal view, Greg?
What's my personal view? I do think that the age view is accurate. I think that Yom could be interpreted as a long period of time. I have no problem with death before the fall, animal death. And I think that it's telling that science is showing us the same thing that Genesis 1 is telling us in terms of the chronology. I think it's telling that the primordial earth, as discussed in Genesis 1, is accurate scientifically, or at least aligns with what our best scientific models speculate about what the primordial earth was like.